Good afternoon to one and
Should
all.
we do the
Hello.
bell, make them quiet down?
I think we'll be okay. We'll be
Okay.
all right. Well, it was nice seeing you a second ago. Now you can see us. Good afternoon to one and all, and thank you so much for coming to this afternoon session. My name is Owsley Brown. I, along with Gray Henry, are your co-chairs for this year's 2013 Festival of Faiths. I know many of you have been here already, but I know some of you may be here for the first time. We want to welcome you. We're so glad you've come. We've had, I have to say, I'm just saying, we have had a dazzling collection of programs so far, and thank you. Much appreciated, I can tell you. And as I keep saying, but it is totally true, no you all, no program in part, and no extraordinary presenters, no program either, but also I want to make sure and give thanks to those that are sort of behind the scenes in helping this happen. And we're going to skip the long list of extraordinary corporate sponsors and other strategic partners here in town, but please do take note of them. They're posted on two big signs in the lobby, and without their support, we simply wouldn't be able to do this. Also, our office, as you can imagine, has been just working unbelievably hard to put this all together with a now rather big and robust team, but that team is really anchored by our executive director, Dr. Kathleen Lyons, along with Sarah Reed Harris and Chris Wooten, and I for one, and I know Gray agrees, they do deserve a huge round of applause.
And Mustafa.
Well, and Mustafa. I mean, it goes on and on. Mustafa, son of Gray, is a saint, and there are many others too. But quick little housekeeping notes. I know we all know this, but let's just double check what our cell phone ringer status is. Mine's here. I'll look again. Yep, I'm still in the off mode. So maybe you can check yours too, and hopefully that'll be all clear. We'll just also mention the house lights are down. Many of you know Father Joe Mitchell. He is with us, has been with us for all of our programs, was our moderator this morning, and is beyond an ally to the Festival of Faiths. He's just an absolute collaborator with us and extraordinary. And so Joe is around, and so for those of you who don't know him, just ask around and you'll find him, I think, pretty quickly. But among the many things that he has done to help our city, he's put together this nice-looking two-sided yellow handout or takeaway or take-home document that is entitled Meditation Opportunities / Contemplative Practice in Metro Louisville. How do you like that? So if you're interested in nice categories that are with headings like Buddhist, Christian, interreligious, non-denominational, there are a whole bunch of options for you and yours to go and continue the spirit of this festival right here in Louisville, Kentucky. So these are being handed out in the lobby. They should be here for the remainder of the festival. And if you're interested, don't forget to pick up one of these. As a way to kind of honor our festival title, we have been bookending. So don't let us forget at the end, because a lot of these talks get really right up to the wire and excellent. And we almost have to fight to get that last little bit of silence in, but we will be beginning, after Gray's introduction of Richard Rohr, beginning our session with a short 3-minute period of silence, and then we'll conclude. So maybe Richard will be the one that does this, but in any case, just know that is coming. And I think with that, do you want to give your remarks and introductions?
Father Richard Rohr, globally recognized ecumenical teacher and author, will share his perspective on silence as the only thing broad enough and deep enough to hold all the contradictions and paradoxes of full reality, and our own reality too. 99.9% of the known universe is silent, and it is in this space that the force fields of life and compassion dwell and expand. We can live there too. I just thought I had to say something. I heard Richard speak many, many years ago at an International Merton meeting in Vancouver. And since this is devoted to His Holiness and Merton, I remember thinking when I heard him speak, this is one of the best speakers I've ever heard. And then Louisville innocently tried to get him to come here. So for the past decade, more than a decade, each organization, the Merton Institute, the Center of Interfaith Relations, we tried and tried, and alas, we gave up. And then the Institute of Contemplative Practice, recently established as part of the Center of Interfaith Relations, we're putting together, Fons Vitae, a volume on Merton's centenary for 2015, and we invited the greatest minds and scholars we could think of to write and address the question that Merton mentioned: we are already one, but we forget to realize that. So Richard Rohr wrote to me by email and said, yes, I would love to contribute. And I wrote him back and I said, we've always wanted to have you come to Louisville. And then he wrote back and said, well, my schedule is booked till the day I retire, which is March or April 2013. And I said, then what about capping your retirement with a visit to Louisville? And so I would like to say, we've all probably read his most recent book, Falling Upwards. I'm just going to say, let us fly upwards with Richard Rohr. Welcome.
There's time. Right. And we're not very schooled at this, as you can tell, so we're forgetting things. Tonight, there's a film at 7 o'clock that is the recordings that were made during Thomas Merton's courses that he gave to the novices at Gethsemane, and it's just him. It's Merton speaking in his own voice. So you might consider coming back for that, and then don't forget to look at your program for the rest of the week, and we'll do our silence now.
Hello. Good to be with you. I hope they turn off the lights so I can see you a little better, but I guess you have to see me, don't you? Well, it's an honor to be here. I didn't really retire, Gray. I just turned 70. And when I turned 70 in March, that was sort of the dividing line we'd drawn in the sand that I would stop traveling to teach. But I'm still teaching from New Mexico by these wonderful gifts that I wish Jesus and Buddha and Paul had to teach via webcast and so forth. But I made one exception. I couldn't turn down Louisville again, and so I'm very, very happy to be here, and hope I can say something that's honestly helpful. Feels like I'm moving away from this. Can you hear okay? You can hear? All right, good. If you can't, just shout out. You know, right after I said yes to this, I got an invitation from what is primarily, I guess, or must be almost primarily the main social justice magazine of the Christian world, Sojourners. And they said, would you write an article on silence? And, I wouldn't have expected them to ask for that. And then they made it the cover article. Now, I begin with that, not because I think it was that good an article, but in many ways I'm going to read from my scribblings beforehand that led me to write the article. But just that people who are primarily interested in issues of justice would at this point recognize how communication, vocabulary, conversation, communication has really reached a very low point. I think we're aware of that in our politics, but we're aware of that in our churches too. And it feels like the only clearinghouse is a reappreciation for this thing called silence. You know, I said at the beginning of my book, Everything Belongs, how do you market that which is inherently unmarketable? You know, it's like, how do you sell silence? How do you make attractive what feels like selling air or selling emptiness or selling something that certainly to the capitalistic mind would not immediately be attractive? Well, that's the job we've got today. I hope I'm not here as a salesman. The most I'm going to do is sort of circle around this mystery. And then we're going to give you time so we can talk about it a little bit and see if we can open up what is clearly a mystery. But here's where I'd like to start. That I'd like us to try to see that silence is a phenomenon in itself. It's not just that which is around words and underneath images and events, but I'd like you to think of it as having, and I think this will become rather evident, I hope, having a life of its own. It's a phenomenon, an ontological identity, we'd say in philosophy. That it is that which precedes all things. And we see that in the very first two verses of Genesis. There's the formless void, as it's called. The Spirit hovering over this formless void, which we would assume, I guess, is silent, and maybe the Spirit is silent too. But the coming together of these two great silences is the beginning of our creation story in the Judeo-Christian tradition. So you could say silence precedes and girds and undergrounds everything. And we can't just see it as an accident, as something unnecessary, but unless we learn how to live there, go there, abide in this different phenomenon, the rest of things, words, events, relationships, identities, I think we could all admit they become rather superficial. They lose meaning. They almost don't have meaning. And all we search for is a life of more events, more situations, which have to ever become ever higher stimulation, more exciting, more color. Some of you know I lived in Cincinnati for 25 years, so used to come down to Gethsemane for my retreats, and stopped here in Louisville off time on the way. And just to come back here after so many years, my, how your downtown has improved. It's really lovely. I mean, not that it was bad. I'm not saying it was bad 25 years ago. But you can see how, I mean, this is the character of America. Everything has to be a little more colorful, a little brighter, a little newer, a little more expensive, a little classier. And then the Americans will come. It's not if you build it, they will come, but if you make it fancy, they will come, all right? And we grow used to this. We take it as normative. I think one of the great teachings for me has been over the years to teach in so many developing countries. I was in Guatemala in February, and it's just a stark and quick recognition that most of the world does not live the way we live. And this is not necessarily the norm. This is not necessarily the healthy. This is not necessarily the best, although I know Americans are trained to think that way. But it's one example of a culture which has some wonderful aspects to it and some very unhealthy aspects. One of those unhealthy being that we really would not see silence by and large as anything attractive or useful or necessary or important or even good. So I'd like us to start by trying to see silence as a living presence of itself, which is primordial and primal. And that if we can find a way, we must find a way to return to this place, to live in this place, to abide in this place. Everything else appears out of it. And when I use the word appear, I mean it takes on reality, substance, significance, meaning. Without it, I guess I said that before, but I'm going to say it again, almost nothing has meaning. It's just another event in a sequence of ever quicker events, which we call our life. And we don't really experience our experiences. We have many experiences, but they do not have the power to change us, to awaken us, to give us that joy that the world cannot give, as Jesus says. So I think to live in this primordial, foundational being, I'm going to call it the foundation of being itself, silence, it creates a kind of sympathetic resonance with what's right in front of us. Without it, we just jump. We're just Mexican jumping beans, reacting, as Father Merton said so beautifully before, always reacting and never living, tasting. There's not much capacity to enjoy or to appreciate or to taste the moment. So let's call silence something that has an ontological quality. Forgive the big word, but that means a character of being to it. It's not the absence of being, but it is a kind of being itself. I can't imagine any of you would have come to a day like this on a weekday and paid money besides, unless you've already experienced that. And I want to say that, so you don't think this is something distant or obtuse or obscure or only ascetics are capable of. I bet you've all experienced it, or you would never come to a day like this. You can only appreciate something that you've already begun to experience. And then you want it to be fed and freed and enlightened within you. So it's a kind of thinking that is not thinking. It's a kind of thinking which sees. Now, that might seem obscure itself, but stay with it. It's an alternative consciousness, silence is. It's a form of intelligence, a form of knowing beyond bodily reacting, which is what we normally call emotion. It's a form of knowing beyond mental analysis, which is what we call thinking, and which has pretty much taken over the human species. It seems by the age of 7, almost all of us have separated our body and our soul from our mind, and we give all of our credence to our mind, disconnect from our bodies, disconnect from our souls. And Descartes was not wrong when he said, I think, therefore I am. He was describing the Western person. Our thinking is who we think we are. And religion, in all of the great world religions, at the higher levels, which maybe not everybody went there, but discovered that this tyrannical mode of thinking has to be relativized, has to be limited, or it takes over, and completely takes over to the complete loss of silence. And pretty soon, words mean less and less. I mean, I don't want to be a cynic. We don't have time for any more cynicism. But we listen to the character of whatever political debate emerges in this country. Whatever, whether it's the issue of guns, whether it's the issue of health care, whatever the recent show is, you just know that the words on either side, I'm not taking sides, mean less and less. It's just the ego uses words to get what it wants. That's what I said in this Sojourners article. The soul doesn't use words. It surrounds words with space, and that's silence. The ego uses words to get whatever it wants. And you all know this. When you're in an argument with your husband, with your wife, that's what we do. We pull out the words that give us power. We pull out the words that make us look right, superior, intelligent, winning the argument. I've done it, you've done it. It's all the ego knows how to do. But words at that level are rather useless. I'm a news watcher, so again, I'm not putting this down, but we all know they have a half an hour to fill. And now with CNN, we have 24 hours a day to fill. And that's okay. It's often very helpful, often not so helpful too, But we recognize that what has happened in our lifetime is that the filling of space with words has become entertainment, news as entertainment. And so we pull out things which are tragic or will draw forth sentiment or reaction, and we call that news, and we settle for that. I've often taught in Europe, and I must say I have to go to Europe, and I'm sure it's not always true there either. I don't mean to idealize them in any way, but to find news that's actually news, and it's about the whole world, and it isn't just about America, and it's not just entertainment. It's really substance, and we have that too, on occasion at least. But I'm saying this is what inevitably is going to happen when there is no appreciation for silence. When the silence around the words is not just as important, or maybe even more important, than the concocting of words. We all become wordsmiths. I have, and I'm used to it now. But I realize, and that's why I had to stop this traveling and talking. I'd done it for 43 years. And I said, okay, 70 is the line in the sand. I gotta live this contemplative life more than just convince everybody else that it's the best thing around, So we're gonna now circle around this mystery of silence. I'm simply reading from my own journal where I was writing my own reflections before I wrote that article for Sojourners. Silence is a kind of wholeness of being. It can absorb contraries. It can absorb paradoxes and contradictions. Maybe that's why we don't like it. There's nothing to argue about. I remember when I was my first years in Cincinnati, I had started a community there called New Jerusalem, and we had wonderful liturgies and God, they were good. I mean, they really were. They were wonderful. Of course, that was the 70s when the Catholic Church was open and free and exciting. But I must say, even with that, everything, not everything, but often it would lead toward argumentation about, inclusive language, which is an important question. Male or female leadership, which is an important question. Do I like that psalm, or is that a violent psalm? That singing is too evangelical. That singing is too Catholic. That singing is too charismatic. So when I went to Albuquerque 26 years ago, I just said, okay, we're not going to argue about all those things. We're just going to pray silently. There was nothing to argue about. But you know what? The numbers went down, right? Not nearly as many people attend our morning contemplative sit as the great liturgies I had in Cincinnati, where there was, great joy and rejoicing, but also something to argue about. The ego loves something it can take sides on. And silence really doesn't allow you to do that. Now, if you're not willing to live inside of that poverty, that would be our Franciscan word, of not feeling right or not feeling better than, or not feeling important, you just sit there in your poverty. On Monday mornings, I often give a little 5-6 minute teaching before we begin. And I say these next 20 minutes, which isn't very long actually, but these next 20 minutes will be an exercise in assured failure. Now you can see how someone who lives in a capitalist culture like we all do, where everything's about competing and comparing and winning. I mean, that's the only game in town. How do you introduce something as innocuous, as harmless, that is going to assure failure, that you can never stand up at the end of your 20 minutes and say, I did it right, I won, I prayed. Do you ever have anybody say, oh, I pray very well? Well, they don't. They don't. But maybe if they limit it to some technique, some external technique, and that's probably why most liturgy becomes a preoccupation with external technique. And priests get all concerned about this, where their hands are and what words they're saying and what color of vestment they're wearing. You can spend your whole life. You can spend your whole life, and some priests do, being concerned about such things. And it doesn't mean that the inner soul has been touched for 1 second, or that you've moved beyond this place of argumentation and judgment and analysis. So what you find in silence is that time actually, now I'm going to talk out of two sides of my mouth. Sometimes when you're really distracted and irritated and stressed, it will seem like ages before that gong gongs again. But on another level, and I only experience this when I have my longer Lenten retreats, where time actually increases inside of silence. It feels like it comes to a fullness, as the New Testament says. Time comes to a fullness, if that makes sense. And I think that's what we mean by being beyond time. It's from chronological time to kairos, where a moment of time is enough. This moment is as perfect as it can be. It's all right here, right now. This is it. This is okay. I'm content. And you wait for such moments, and I must say they happen more than I ever thought I deserved or would experience. If we can see silence as the ground of all words and the birth of all words, then you will find that when you speak, your words will be more well chosen and calm. I think that was one of the things so beautiful about Father Martin who just preceded me, I talk so darn fast and try to say too much, But his words were, as my Father Francis would say, well chosen and chaste. Francis told us to always use words that were well chosen and chaste. And not to preach unless we had something to say, Not just to preach to be preaching. So I think that when you see something as beautiful, and I hope you've seen a lot of beautiful things in your life, I think that beauty, and try to imagine how this is true, emerges from the silence around it. Maybe that's why we're quiet in art galleries, I don't know. But if something is not surrounded by this ontological identity of silence, of space, it's hard to appreciate something as singular and beautiful. If it's all mixed in with everything else, its singularity as a beautiful object does not stand out unless it's surrounded with silence. Now, I'm going to describe silence in a larger way than simply audio sound, just as Father Martin was doing. Whenever emptiness, what seems like empty space, absence of sound, whenever emptiness becomes its own kind of fullness, you've just experienced what I mean by silence. Right? Whenever emptiness becomes its own kind of fullness. One author I read years ago, and I wrote this in my journal at that time, so it's not original to me. He or she said, silence is the net below the tightrope walker. So we're walking, trying to find the right words to explain our experience. But silence is that safety net that allows us to fall into it, that says and admits, like poets do, that no word will ever be right. And the great spaciousness and safety of a net beneath a tightrope walker, that's silence. I get a lot of angry letters. A lot of people don't like me, and they are convinced I'm a heretic and trying to destroy the church. I don't know where they get that from, really. I just sometimes I do say things a little differently, but I've sort of paid my dues, and at my age, I figure I have the freedom to be true to my experience while also trying to honor the tradition. That has educated me very well. And but when you get a lot of hate letters, not that I get a lot. I mean, 1 out of 10 are hate letters, but it's always "you said." And I'm not being defensive in saying this. It's hardly ever what I said. It's always people who want to hold you to a damning word or an unorthodox phrase, and then they'll give it the worst possible interpretation. And you can tell there's no silence, no safety net around their own letter, but they don't allow me one either. They hold me. Now, hold me to what they think I said. Sometimes it's like living in a minefield to be in the world of religion. It's just people who you feel feel, and it doesn't mean very much, but already have a negative intent toward you, and whatever you say, you're not going to win. Now, whenever I have any possibility of answering those letters and thinking I can be heard in a somewhat spacious, congenial way, I really try to do that, and I try never to return unkindness with unkindness, but just to open up the field, if at all possible. Some letters, usually those that are not signed, of course, you can't answer them. But you realize the words were just intended to hurt. That's all. That was their intention, apparently. They don't ask for an answer. I just want to punish you. Now, that's what happens to words when they're not surrounded with silence. I think Father Martin referred to this too in his own better words, but I think there's two kinds of silence. There's the natural, refreshing silence of the introverted personality, or just the pause between a conversation. But there's a perfect spiritual silence that builds on that doesn't need to fill it up with nervous laughter or a joke that isn't really funny, or or trying to be clever. I watch these sitcoms. I don't watch many of them. I used to watch Seinfeld. I thought that was funny for some reason. But I just had to stop watching them after a while, because I felt what a number this must be doing on our kids. Because it's a half an hour of clever, supposedly clever, put-downs. Listen to it. It's just clever put-downs, clever repartees back and forth for half an hour. And I'm sure if you're a little kid, a little 14-year-old trying to find your identity and trying to find how you can make it in the world, you probably feel like you got to talk that way. And of course, most kids aren't that quick or that clever or that verbal or that confident, so they just give up and slink into the corner and think that they're not, the clever staff or people on Friends. Remember Friends? Yeah, it was okay. Yeah, it wasn't much silence there. They can't afford silence. It's got to be a half an hour. Well, what is it? 24 minutes of clever back and forth and canned music or canned laughter in between. So if life is words, and that's what we've made it into, especially after the invention of the printing press, then you could say, and this is only one way to say it, if life is words, you could say death, that great mystery that we haven't walked through yet, is silence. And therefore you could say, it's not the only way to say it, faith is and silence are both, faith and silence both, are practicing for death. That's what faith is. And finding out that it's okay. That was the thrust of my last book, Immortal Diamond, where I begin with this epigraph from Ken Wilber, who says, well, let me read it. He says it better than I'll remember it. The fact that life and death are not two is extremely difficult to grasp, not because it's so complex, but precisely because it's so simple. And then Kathleen Dowling Singh, a wonderful hospice worker in Florida, the hospice people are really emerging as almost a new locus for theology and spirituality. These people who've accompanied now sometimes hundreds of people in the last days and weeks and months of life. And they know something about what's real and what's not real, and what lasts and what doesn't last, that the rest of us would do well to know. I think all clergy should have to be a hospice worker for a while. I'm not sure we should give a sermon. I'm not sure that we have anything to talk about. Anyway, hers is the second epigraph. And she says, we miss the unity of life and death at the very point where our ordinary mind begins to think about it. So contemplation is precisely calling that ordinary mind into question and saying this that you call thinking cannot get you there. In The Naked Now, I called it dualistic thinking, where you separate everything like life and death. It's almost the only mind left in the West. We think it's what it means to be educated, to be very good at dualistic thinking, at really judgmental thinking. That's what dualistic thinking is, where you choose one side, you prefer one side, and the other side of the question that you've not yet been exposed to or you're threatened by or is beyond your experience or threatens you in any way, you call it untrue. Yeah, they do. Most of us do. Well, that's not true. You just haven't been exposed to it yet, that's all. Or it threatens your ego, and so you call it untrue. This is the level of conversation we have. Non-dual thinking is precisely contemplation, where you stop doing that. Now, what that leads to when you stop choosing sides and stating preferences of what you want, what you need, what you prefer, and what you like, writing this endless commentary, as Father said, on everything, you'll feel poor for a moment, and you'll be stunned into an embarrassing silence. Now, in the Christian tradition, and this stood the test of time for a good 1,500 years, certainly the cloud of unknowing in the 14th century, they were still talking this way, that knowing had to be balanced by unknowing or not knowing. And when you put those two together, knowing with not knowing and being willing not to know, you have this marvelous phenomenon called faith, which allows you to keep an open horizon, an open field. I mean, scientists do this better than clergy do today. They can live with hypotheses. They can live with a theory. And we can't. We have to have the whole truth right now, in words. And my denomination has it and your denomination doesn't, you know? What a waste of time. Huh? And we got even more arrogant about that after the food fights of the Reformation, where Europe divided initially into Catholics and Lutherans in Germany, and each group had to prove that it was 100% right, and the other group was 100% wrong, which is never true. And then, on the heels of that, we have this strangely named phenomenon, the Enlightenment. They stole our word. Did you ever think of that? That was our word, enlightenment, John's Gospel, 7th chapter. And suddenly now, to be enlightened means to be rational, which is a fine mode of thinking. It really is. It produced the Industrial Revolution, the Scientific Revolution, the Mechanical Revolution, the Medical Revolution. Most of us wouldn't be sitting here without it right now. Thank you, God, for the dualistic rational mind. But there's a ceiling above which the rational mind cannot go. I talk about this in The Naked Now. And when I wrote that book, I said there were 5 issues above the ceiling that the rational mind could not process. Love isn't rational. You know that. And yet most of you would die for it. Love, death itself, not rational, can't be explained. Life itself, suffering, where many people break down in the presence of something they try to resolve rationally or dualistically, try to blame somebody for it. That's what the ego does. And any notion of infinity. Those are what I call the 5 biggies. Now, since I wrote that book, I've actually added a 6th. I think I'd add sex now. It was probably repressed in my celibate mind, you know. But I think I'd add sex is just, I mean, any of you have ever had sex, there's nothing rational about this, all right? And yet people live and die for it. What made us ever think that the great things were rational? Huh? And you close down. And the trouble is we've tried to resolve issues at that level with dualistic morality, dualistic dogmas and doctrines, which is low-level consciousness, and can't get to the higher levels. That's why you are living in just such a marvelous time. And I mean that sincerely, where the contemplative mind is being rediscovered. And one reason I said yes to this invitation was because you probably know the man down the road here, Thomas Merton. Many say, even in Europe, almost single-handedly was the wizard who pulled back the veil and reintroduced the word contemplation to a Catholic church that no longer understood it itself. Because after the Reformation and after the Enlightenment, we circled the wagons into a little defensive circle. Each of our denominations did the same. We lusted after certitude and order and explanation to prove that our denomination was right, our religion was right. And except for those people who, by great love and great suffering, and there were many of those, came to contemplation on their own without even knowing they were contemplatives. For the most part, contemplation stopped being systematically taught, even in the religious orders, even at Gethsemane. And that's what, I gave the retreat in 1985 down the road here. And it was a wonderful 8 days. And I remember I thought the way I would gain their favor. I mean, I was a kid then. I had hair and I looked young. And all these venerable old monks, they were the age I am now. And so I thought, well, I better do something to earn my keep. I got to talk to them for 8 days. So I thought the way to do it was to quote the man himself. How could you go wrong? He's buried right outside the church there. So the first day I raised my hand heroically, as Merton himself said, thinking this would bring them all to my knees, And you know what I heard? Clearing of throats and shuffling and rearranging of their habits and looking out the window, all kind of avoidance techniques. So I thought it was this is an accident. I mean, these holy monks, this isn't in-house jealousy, is it? Or this isn't no prophet being honored in his own country, is it? So I tried it again the second day. I said, as Thomas Merton said, same rearranging habits, looking out the window. I don't think anybody walked out, but at any rate, I asked Brother Bruno, some of you might remember him, was a dear friend of mine for many years. He used to force people to listen to my tapes in the dining hall. And I pulled him aside and said, Bruno, am I doing something wrong here? I said, am I doing myself any favor by quoting Thomas Merton? He said, well, Richard, some of the old guys here didn't like him that much. I said, really? I thought, certainly it must be in-house jealousy. No, he says, because he told us we were not contemplatives. That's a quote. We were just introverts. He let out the secrets. Monasteries' religious life was filled with introverts. Nice people. They're just as nice as extroverts, like I am, But they just like to be quiet. They could look at the tabernacle for 3 hours and not say anything to anybody. There are 5s on the Enneagram, if you know the Enneagram. But it's not necessarily non-dual consciousness. You understand? I remember when I gave a retreat to poor Clare nuns, beautiful, happy, holy women. God, many of them had achieved a high level of contemplation, but they still had such lousy dualistic training. And I remember this one nun every day, oh God, please bless those poor Protestants. At least she loved you all. Bless them. She says, I know they're not going to go to heaven, but please take care of them. They mean well. After about 4 days, I said, Sister, what tells you that Protestants aren't going to heaven? Well, they don't believe in the one holy Catholic Apostolic Church. Oh, I see. Okay. Do you realize they think the same thing about us? She didn't know that they call us the whore of Babylon, So it all depends on what side you're going to take, That's dualistic thinking. So there are a lot of people whose soul is there in the silent, spacious, open place, usually because of the path of great love or great suffering. Those are the natural paths to contemplation. The third path is the way of prayer, which can accelerate the whole thing. But it can also be, pax perniciosa, as John Cashin called it, dangerous peace, where because you go the way of prayer, you really never go the way of great love, and you avoid great suffering. So it can be dangerous. Those who fall into the safety net of silence find is that it is not a fall into individualism. In fact, if it is pax perniciosa, dangerous peace. It's quite the contrary, but it's a leap into communality. That you know what you are experiencing here is held by the whole. That you're not alone anymore. That's why you can, if you're called to it, be celibate, because you live a kind of intimacy with everything. Everything is a jolt, a joy, a possibility, a communion, a connection. In fact, I think it's wrong for anybody. It's really stupid for anybody to choose to be celibate if they have not moved to some level of contemplative prayer. Because basically it's not going to work. And that's why we've had the pedophilia scandals we've had. Well-intentioned young boys went off to seminaries thinking they could live this life of communion at this deeper level and didn't have the tools to know how to do it. But we did on a lesser level the same thing to the laity by telling them to believe doctrines like the Trinity or the two natures of Christ, neither of which can be understood with a dualistic mind. All you can do is, intellectually assent to them, but it doesn't mean anything. It has no dynamic possibility in your soul that opens up your heart, opens up your mind. The principle of three, which we call Trinity, undoes the principle of two. And it says that all the power is in the relationship between. When I first taught extensively on the Trinity with Cynthia Bourgeot in Canada, we did a long course, and the people, of course, were arguing about, well, why do we have to call them by the masculine, And only a woman could get away with this. She says, listen, I don't care what words you use. Make them all masculine if you want. She says, and don't try to make the Holy Spirit feminine, because we still lose. It's 2-1. She says, or make them all feminine if you want. I don't care. And this was the genius. Just because the whole important thing about the doctrine of the Trinity is all the power is not in the names of the three particles, but in the relationship between. The power and the meaning, the capacity for giving and receiving. That's the mystery of Trinity. But once you have a dynamic water wheel of outflowing love, as our St. Bonaventure called it, the flow only flows in one direction, always positive, always giving, always outpouring. But we like to pull it back into the principle of two, where it's argumentative, oppositional, either or. Whereas Trinity undoes that. It's no either or to choose. All you can do is jump in the flow and allow it to happen. Now, I want to make one distinction between solitude and silence. Solitude of itself is not silence. Solitude can be just because you don't like people, or you're angry at your wife, or or you want to get away from all these noisy people. A true solitude has to fall into this larger silence, what Father Martin called silence with a big S. Very good. It's a shared silence. I suppose those of you psychologically educated, you'd call it the collective unconscious. It's fine if you want to call it that. All truth is one. We're just coming at it from different angles. Last year when I was writing this Immortal Diamond book, I had taken Lent in a hermitage. And one afternoon I was just waxing eloquent on my little laptop about the Holy Spirit as a force field. As this energy between, as this space in between, this silence in between, the in-between of everything, and how it gives back and forth. And I was very proud of myself. The words were flowing. It sounded good. Then all of a sudden I had a huge dose of writer's doubt, or thinking, oh God, everybody's going to think, Richard, you're just trying to be clever again and say things in a new way. But I had developed what the Holy Spirit is a force field. There's morphogenic fields, there's electromagnetic fields, and all of them, there's gravitational fields. We can't explain. What is this allurement, this attraction, this change that happens invisibly, this movement that happens invisibly? And yet it's the most powerful thing in the universe. So the metaphor worked for me. But I had this moment of doubt. I minimized the screen and did something that I told myself I wasn't going to do while I was in the Hermitage. I said, well, it's about time to check my email. Even the Holy Spirit works that too. So I up my email, Comcast, there it is. Today's email, last one, a theologian that had just been on a retreat I'd given. And he said, Richard, you can delete this, you don't need to read it, but that conversation we had at lunch, I thought you might be interested in it. And if not, no questions asked. So I download it across the screen. The Holy Spirit as a force field. In the German theology of Wolfhart Pannenberg, it's a masterpiece. I mean, he was saying much better, as the Germans do, what I was trying to say. And now we've got these new metaphors, the scientific metaphors, to understand spiritual things. We thought science was our enemy for 3 centuries. Again and again and again, they have this new respect for mystery, for paradox, for hypotheses, for theory, which means with patience they learn, that they're willing to learn and to understand more patiently and more humbly than it seems to me we often were. So silence holds the contraries in a way that words cannot. It mediates and resolves the polarities. Each side, and I got this from another author too, I can't remember who. Each side must travel over the broad, appeasing surface of silence before it can reach the other. And the silence is the space in between. Each side of every argument must travel over the broad, appeasing surface of silence before it can reach the other. And walking over that broad road of silence, it is much more humble and less judgmental about the other side, and doesn't put words in its mouth like sometimes people do to me. Without that silence around words and around ideas, there's only, brothers and sisters, endless analysis, endless commentary. And have you ever rehearsed an upcoming argument in your head? Of course you have, with your wife especially, or your husband, or someone close to you, or your boss. Just like the prodigal son returning home, he's practicing what he's going to say to dad. We all do that. But if you notice when you do that, you again use the words that are going to win your case. They're going to defeat the other side. You're not, be honest, you're not really searching for truth, right? You're searching to look good, right? To win, to look right, to keep the job, to keep your marriage, or whatever it might be. We all do, and God understands that. But the contemplative mind has moved beyond that. And so it reads reality at a different level than either or. My next book is going to be called Yes and. Yes and. And not yes but, that sounds contrary, all right? But just yes, I'm trained in the tradition. I know the tradition. I know orthodoxy. But we Franciscans, we always called ourselves an alternative orthodoxy inside the church. That we emphasize different things. Francis wasn't an academic. He emphasized living a simple, nonviolent life in this world. And the line that so many of you have seen on posters in the last 10 years is a paraphrase of something he says to us in our rule. Preach the gospel at all times, and when absolutely necessary, use words. Preach the gospel at all times. Lifestyle was the gospel. The emphasis, sort of like the Mennonites and the Amish and the Waldensians and the Quakers. Let's not argue about words, because it always leads to dualistic taking of sides. Let's just do it. Let's live in a way that shouts Jesus. That live in a way that no one can deny, exudes the love and the compassion of Jesus. Oh, let's see. What else should I tell you here? Well, I guess I tried to say that already, that silence is like, I'd like you to think it like a substance of itself, a reality in itself, not just, as I said at the beginning, the absence of sound. Inside of silence, I find that things find, especially extended silence over big, testy issues, things find their true order naturally. And I think when things find their true order, what's important, what lasts, what's real, which Jesus would call the reign of God or the kingdom of God, being the big stuff, and that most the rest is passing. Not most the rest, all the rest. And those things you were emotional about last Wednesday, you can't even remember your emotions from last Wednesday. And that's what the Buddhists rightly call emptiness. It has no substance. And yet you and I give our lives for these emotions that are gone, 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 over and gone. But we wrap our ego around them and give them substantial reality when they don't deserve it. Inside of silence, what those issues that are rising tend to do is I hope this makes sense, I'll try to say it right. These issues, they connect with the silence itself instead of horizontally connecting with one another. When they connect with one another, you just get competitive and comparative. Men tend to be competitive, women tend to be comparative. That's a generalization. But both of them are ego games, where I don't have to compare or compete. I just let it stand alone inside this broad space, inside this spacious place, and connect to the whole, connect to what lasts, connect to the real, connect to what Jesus would call the kingdom of God. My metaphor for Jesus' kingdom of God is simply the big picture. In the big picture, does this matter? When you're on your deathbed, will this matter? Right? Will you be thinking about this? Will you be arguing about this? Now, to pull back from the tug of emotion and ego that wants to be right, wants to win, wants to put the other down, wants to humiliate the enemy, I can see why the Desert Fathers called it spiritual warfare. It's warfare because there's something so sweet. Damn it, it's sweet about taking sides and feeling you've made your case, and you've won the argument, even in your head. So silence allows things to emerge, it seems to me, in their wholeness. As Ken Wilber would say, all levels, all stages, in their wholeness. Instead of, usually we're just trapped at one level and at one stage. And at that one level and that one stage, we make our case. And that's why all arguments in between people at different levels of growth are doomed to failure. They're just doomed to failure. You wonder why any arguments ever work. Outside of the contemplative mind, they're almost always egocentric. They're about winning. They're not love of truth, they're love of victory, which is what the ego wants. And I've been there enough. That's the only reason I can describe it well is I've done it. The dualistic mind loves to exaggerate the differences. Watch yourself do it. Don't take my word for it. You will use highly inflammatory words, 4-letter words if possible. That'll make it sound like it's really true, you know? This is half of America. I'm sure it's half of Canada, too. I'm not unduly picking on America. One author called this a psychological defect in the human person, the need to exaggerate differences. When you haven't experienced communion, when you haven't experienced unitive consciousness, union, the contemplative mind, all you have are your differences. And so you've got to overplay them. And in the first half of life, we all do that. How can you not? You expect kids to do that. You know, their group, their team, their nationality, their race, their religion, their neighborhood. This is almost the history of the world, because most of history, in my opinion, has been in the first half of life up to now. It never got to the broad seeing of the second half of life, where it's not about winning anymore. It's just about being. And silence is what allows that being. So I want you to see, since I've used the word being, I want you to see, if possible, silence itself as a kind of being in the great chain of being. Bonaventure taught us, Bonaventure was the intellectual who took, Francis was a non-academic, right? He just intuited it. He was an Italian spiritual genius, naturally, and mistrusted books, mistrusted academia. But in the first generation, the friars went off to Oxford and Cologne and Paris to teach, to probably evangelize these young intellectuals. Well, wouldn't you know it, a bunch of these smart guys then joined the order. And one of those was Bonaventure. And he spoke of the great chain of being. And Duns Scotus, another early Franciscan, said, "You may speak of being with one voice, from the being of the earth itself, to the waters upon the earth, to the minerals within the earth, the flowers and trees and grasses, the animals, the humans, the angelic choirs, the divine." And he said, once you stop seeing the divine in any one link of that chain, the whole thing falls apart. That's the world we live in. The whole thing fell apart. I mean, this is not an oversimplification. Either you see God in all things, or eventually, very quickly actually, you can't see God anywhere, even in your own species. And we spent the last 500 years dividing and deciding where God was. Well, he's in our church, but not in yours. Isn't that clever? Why did he just happen to choose mine, huh? Always it was mine, my group that God tended to prefer. We Catholics were raised on a horrible little document called the Baltimore Catechism. The reason I call it horrible, it was written, nothing against Monsignors from New Jersey, but it was written by a Monsignor from New Jersey with no high degree in theology, and it was foisted upon generations of American Catholic kids. I still have my dog-eared copy, I really do, and I happen to know what question 16 is. Question 16 is, where is God? And I'm going to find out right now in this august audience who are the bona fide Catholics. Because we had to memorize the answers. It's a one-sentence answer. I'm going to ask the question, and I want you Catholics to answer. Where is God? God is everywhere. Excellent. Question 16. God is everywhere. Well, if you read the rest of the Baltimore Catechism, it in effect, Monsignor McGuire said, well, we really didn't mean what we said in question 16. God really is not everywhere. He's only in the Roman Catholic Church, right? And not only is he only in the Roman Catholic Church, he's only in the tabernacle. And that's if the priest celebrated a valid mass and was in the state of grace, I guess. And he's locked up. He's under lock and key. Do you get it? You see what happened. God is hardly anywhere. That's the secular word. We gave birth to secularism by not appreciating the silence and the beauty and the grace glue that connects everything in the universe. By not honoring it, by not recognizing it and loving it, we created atheists, it seems to me, or at least agnostics. So silence allows the whole. It doesn't get lost in the parts. It doesn't over-identify with the parts. Without silence, almost all things become boring, superfluous, or just another thing. And you become preoccupied with size, mass, speed, influence, celebrities. You don't become preoccupied with meaning or significance. I made the mistake of making this point. One of the last talks I gave last year was in Charlotte. I didn't know anything about Charlotte, and I started making fun of NASCAR. I said, nothing against NASCAR, really. But it was just a good example, you know. I said, why would you really think that going around in a circle faster than other people is that exciting? And I really developed it, not realizing I was just digging my grave, you know. The whole crowd became quiet. I said, did I say something wrong? They said, Father, NASCAR's based right here. I said, oh, okay, let's use another image. And we can always use another image. But that's what happens is speed and sound and mass take over. You see it in teenagers. It's obsession with speed and sound and mass. When you don't have meaning, when there is no silence around things that gives them inherent significance or inherent value. Just a few more things, and then we'll open this up. So I want you to think of silence, and I don't mean this as cheap poetry, as an ever-faithful companion. An ever-faithful companion. A portal to constantly deeper connection with whatever's in front of you. It doesn't need to be big or important anymore. It can be a stone. It can be a grasshopper. I did it with a roadrunner in my yard in New Mexico day before yesterday. He just stood there and looked at me, and I looked at him. Anything can convert you once you surround it with this reverent silence that gives it significance, identity, singularity, importance, value. What Duns Scotus called the thisness of everything. Scotus taught us, building again on Francis's love of animals and creatures, brother, sun, sister, moon. He said, God does not create genus and species. God only creates this, you, me, this frog, this moment, this dog. And the fact that this dog, this frog, is persisting in being this moment means God is choosing it, or it would fall into oblivion. There is only thisness in Franciscan philosophy. That's why so many poets like that way of seeing. Gerard Manley Hopkins was a Scotist, as was Thomas Merton, by the way. Silence is a dwelling place that is at once horizontal. It allows you to remain connected with the thisness, the singularity of everything, but also vertical at the same time. It allows you to find those eternal images, those eternal meanings. I find that silence attracts meaning. You stay silent for a whole hour, it will be hard not to write a poem. That when I did that hermitage in 86, when the abbot gave me it after the retreat, I think I filled about 4 of these journals in that 6-month period. There was so much silence, everything became real. Everything deserved a poem. Silence discloses the fullness of the now instead of always waiting, as I often do, I confess, instead of waiting for the next thing to happen, the next thing which is going to be more exciting. But brothers and sisters, if you forget everything else, let me say this to you. How you do anything is how you do everything. How you do anything is how you do everything. And how you do in this moment is how you're going to do the next moment. And if you're bored to death with this moment, you're going to be bored to death with the next moment. So you got to awaken right now to awakening, to let it influence you. What it means to be vulnerable before a moment is to give it the power to change you. If you don't give another person, another animal, event, situation, emotion, the power to influence you, to change you, you're not intimate with the moment. You're not vulnerable before the moment. In many ways, I think that kind of intimacy, that kind of vulnerability is the very name of spirituality. If we could live our whole life, and that'd be heroic, with that kind of semi-permeable membrane that you allow events in and you allow yourself out. And that space where they meet is silence, where there aren't quick answers, there aren't quick names for things. One of my hermitages I did in Arizona, the beautiful Sonoran Desert, and I remember I was just fascinated. It's a very different cactus than we have in New Mexico. We're the Chihuahuan Desert. And I just couldn't settle till I went down to town and bought a cactus book and could give a name to each one of those cacti, you know. That's a barrel cactus, you know, that's a cholla cactus. And then I felt quite satisfied, you know, I had named the cactus. And it's okay, I'm sure God just smiled. But I realized after I'd named all the cactus that I was incapable of just enjoying them without a name. Why did they have to have a name? They just were what they were in their thisness, in their nowness, in their here-ness, right here, right now. I got 3 more pages. I'm not going to bore you with all of it. What I found silence does, if you respond to a little bit of silence, it sort of hides, and then you get bored and think, oh, I got to stimulate myself right now. But if you remain open, then it reveals more. It reveals and hides. It reveals and hides. It reveals and hides. Now, again, I've had longer times where I'm able to experience that over a length of time. But most of us, before, when the hiding begins, okay, it's getting boring. Nothing's happening now. This isn't exciting anymore. I'm not learning anything new. We go turn on CNN. Do you understand? We seek stimulation. So be patient with it. It gives a little, and then it gives more if you don't abuse the first little. If you don't, sometimes I'll get a little insight and I'll immediately, like we priests do, make a sermon out of it, you know? I've got next Sunday's sermon, there it is. I made it into a manufactured commodity, so that'll impress all of you. And then I don't get any more. But if I can leave it open-ended, don't settle the dust. Don't resolve the conflict. Don't seek a glib, quick answer, but leave it in the silent space. That's why people who love silence are usually more humble and more patient, because they have to learn it every day and in the way they work with their own mind. They don't rush to judgment. That's what it comes down to. They don't rush to judgment. They leave it open. So real silence moves us from knowing things to basically what I'm going to call the perception of a presence. Now, don't make that ooey gooey and overly supernatural, but it has a reality. There's a mutuality. There's an I-thou relationship, as Martin Buber would call it. He said an I-it relationship is when we experience everything as a commodity. as useful, as utilitarian. But the I, thou, and when is when it simply is what it is, as it is, without me adjusting it, naming it, changing it, fixing it, controlling it, or explaining it. Wow. But that, I promise you, is the peace the world cannot give. Now that doesn't mean, and I know if I don't answer this, this will be the first question. That doesn't mean that there isn't a place for explaining, that there isn't a place for understanding. But let me try to draw it together on this. That you first have to learn to say yes to the moment. Yes, it is what it is. You have to begin with yes. If you start with no, which is critiquing it, judging it, pigeonholing it, analyzing it, dismissing it, if you start with no, I'm telling you, trust me on this, if you start with no, it's very hard to get back to yes. It is, please trust me on that. So what the contemplative mind is learning to start with yes. That's it. Before I pigeonhole it, before I label it, before I control it, before I need to understand it or name it, it is what it is, and God made it, and it was good. And I find that which is good in it, even the serial killer, still bears the divine image. And I first have to honor that and respect that and bow before that. Then, I admit, at a later moment, once I've got the clear-headedness that comes from yes, that when the head has moved down into the heart, that's what we called Franciscan prayer, when the head was lower than the heart, then there might well be, and often needs be, some necessary no's. Now, Bill, I respect you, but you can't keep treating your wife that way, or whatever the issue is, where necessary and truthful things have to be said. But then you've earned the right to say it. Do you see? You've honored the person in the honor that they deserve. And then the irony is you're actually much more successful in the critique. Usually, if there's any chance they can hear it, that's the only time they can hear it anyway. So let me stop at that and invite Father up. I think he's going to MC these hopeful questions that are coming. And I hope I didn't talk too theoretically or theologically. Do you know Father here? He's from the cathedral.
I'm Father Jeff Nicholas. I'm the pastor at the cathedral. And in my defense, I knew God was everywhere. I just didn't know it was question 16.
That's good.
So I have been tasked with the wonderful task of kind of keeping that Chronos time going. And in just a moment, we're going to have an opportunity for questions. So we've got some microphones that are in the assembly at different places, although having a hard time seeing them, but I'm sure they'll wave a lot or something like that. While you perhaps contemplate what kind of question you would like to ask Father Richard, let me just remind everyone that at the conclusion this evening, we have a reception in the lobby where not only will we have some wonderful refreshments, but also there'll be an opportunity for some book signing. Father Richard has several books out there that you can get signed. And also a reminder that later this evening, we're going to have a wonderful opportunity to actually hear the voice of Thomas Merton, a little DVD that's been put together called Merton in His Own Voice, taken from sessions where he was talking with those novices at Gethsemane. And that's at 7 o'clock a bit later on. So, Father Richard, I have one question, though.
You can
one
start.
question.
Good.
I did a thing at my last parish. I was part of a team that did a thing on compassion. Mm. And you wrote something about how compassion is a matter of the both and it's going deeper instead of right or left. You know, it was right in the midst of all the elections and things and the like. Could you share perhaps a bit of compassion's place in this silence, that this being you were speaking of?
You know, it's the heart of the matter. I think it's where we want to lead this whole weekend, is in the direction of compassion. If it's not about love, it's not religion, and it's not good religion. So we can't make it just mind control or spiritual disciplines. It's all, for all of us, for the sake of becoming a more loving person. What the contemplative world discovered, it seems to me, is that the mind became the great enemy of compassion. Because, as you already said, it took sides. It loves to take sides, exaggerate the differences, and then win. So to be compassionate, you first have to begin to surrender. I think it takes our whole lifetime. But you have to begin to surrender that need to win. That need to think of yourself as better than her, smarter than him, richer than them. All of that stuff is just low-level consciousness. So compassion can't even happen until you are at the beginnings of non-dual consciousness. You will use even, and as a priest, I'm sure you've discovered this too, you've seen people who do works of charity to win brownie points with God or with the pastor. That even charity can be prostituted. It's no longer compassion. It's all about me looking charitable.
It's that ego.
Yeah, ego's back in charge. Me earning God's love or so forth. All of the institutes of religion can be highly misused and will be misused if they're not coming out of compassion and expressing compassion. Now, I admit, it takes our whole lifetime to get there, to purify that. And the way you get there is by doing it wrong. Realizing, I didn't go down there to the soup kitchen today because I cared about those people. I mean, this is, very humiliating. I wanted to look good. I wanted to think well of myself. Or, there was no softened heart toward those people at all. In fact, I was looking down on them in my mind and judging them. You almost have to do it wrong to learn what it means to do it right. So don't hate yourself. Don't shame yourself when you see those baser motives. That's the only way. The steps to perfection are necessarily imperfect. Necessarily. But you have to recognize them as imperfect and say, okay, God, love, life, help me to do it better. Show me how to do it better.
But to recognize it, I imagine you have to step into that silence and reflect on it.
Which is a kind of detachment from myself. And if you're not capable of detaching from yourself, standing back almost on a little viewing platform and looking at Richard over there he's doing it again. Now, when I was a young man, I'd hate myself for that. I've learned to be compassionate here too. And I realized I used to call myself, I'm sorry to confess, 4-letter words. Words I would not call you, I would call myself. I won't repeat them here in polite company, all right? But in my inner dialogue, I would put myself down, and until somewhere in the middle of life, God seemed to tell me, if you treat yourself that way, you're going to treat other people that same way. And you're going to be calling them, at least in your mind, that same 4-letter word that you called yourself. So I had to stop doing it here. How you do anything is how you do everything.
Yeah. Very good. Thank you. Well, let's see if we have some questions. There's right.
Hi, Father Jeff.
Hi.
Hi, Richard.
Hello.
Thank you. You've done a beautiful talk. It seems to me that there are types of... I'm right here.
Oh, you're over here?
Yeah. Okay. Trying to record this with my phone in. It seems to me there are types of silence, and I'm a lover of contemplativism and spent time at Gethsemane as well. When I meditate, there are times when I push away thoughts that come to me during meditation, and then there are other times that I enjoy far more when I let the thought develop. And so it's a personal question. You said you can do it wrong and learn. I've been doing it wrong, and so I'm hoping to learn something here. when you're in meditation, which form of silence do you seek of those that I just described or others?
Well, and now if I don't speak to it at all, please come back. I would go so far as to say now, there is no such thing as a distraction. Father Martin was saying the same thing earlier about the buzzsaw, you know. There is no such thing. Everything that comes up is data for you to learn how you react to it and how you react against it. So you should see everything that emerges out of the endless flow of emotions and thoughts and feelings as another opportunity for letting go. It's like, it feels like 20 minutes of dying. 20 minutes of dying every morning, just letting go, not that, I'm not that, I don't need that, I don't need that, goodbye to you. And yet I always say after the 20 minutes, I stand up again and Richard is still here, he didn't really die. That all that stuff that I thought was death was unnecessary baggage. I think when we lost the contemplative tradition, like when I was a novice in Cincinnati in 1961, God bless, I had a holy, wonderful novice master. But he basically had lost the older tradition and tried to teach us concentration. Don't think of an elephant, you understand? Don't think of naked ladies. Right? It doesn't work. It doesn't work. It's amazing, and this is where the Eastern world has been so much a friend to us, because we ran to dogmas and doctrines and conclusions, but we lost the meticulous self-observation that so much of Buddhism has taught us, for example. To say, I don't know how to get there to being a peaceful person. We lost the technology, if you don't mind me using that word. And when we lost it, we thought concentration would do it. Whereas now, I mean, the two main schools in the Christian world that I'm working with are those who either practice letting go or practice replacing with the sacred word. Or some use the breath too. I think they all work, and to be honest, I move between them. Because I'm a high intuitive and very trapped in my words, I love words, I often, when I'm really into my idea world, I've got to use another word to let go of the compulsive word. That's the only, and letting go doesn't even work. It's the difference between replacement therapy and detachment therapy, I guess, you know? But I move between detachment and replacement. I hope that helps.
Question.
In the trial, say again? Oh, microphone, okay. Microphone, yes. In the trial of Jesus before Pilate, what do you suppose, if there was any role or place or function of silence? Or maybe not. What do you think?
That's a wonderful question. Because the text does say, doesn't it, that he stood there at least for a while, silent? Yes. Is that what you're referring to?
Say again?
That Jesus stood before Pilate?
Yes, that episode.
In silence, yes. I think we should probably make more use of that. You know, a friend said to me years ago, an existing ideology of resentment, and every one of you in this room has experienced this, when someone has already decided to hate you, all right? They already don't like you. An existing ideology of resentment, no matter what you do or what you say, will be used to deepen that resentment. You can stand on your head, and they'll say, oh, you're doing that just because. We've all been in that kind of situation. You can't win with an existing ideology of resentment. That's much of our world. And I think you've pointed out something brilliantly there. That's Pilate, it seems, although he's actually presented as a rather neutral figure. But Jesus must judge that against empire, who Pilate represents, there's no way his language, his wisdom, would be acceptable to the language of empire. And whatever he says is going to be used against him. So his judgment is not, every action creates an equal and opposite reaction. Why create the reaction? Just keep silent. Thank you. I'm going to use that more myself.
Do you think it was an act of nonviolence?
Jesus. It would have to be, wouldn't it? Yeah. Actively practicing verbal nonviolence. Yeah. When you do that, we've had employees at the center. We have 30-some employees out in Albuquerque. We've had employees we've had to let go of over the years for all kinds of reasons. And, sometimes they've said rather unkind things about the center after they leave. That happens in any institution, I'm sure. Is that a practice of nonviolence? Well, I have to let people think the worst of me, of us, rather than say the other side of the story.
To win.
To win.
Exactly.
Oh, that's hard. You just literally have to put a clothespin on your tongue, Shut up, Richard, because the only reason you're saying that is so they think well of you. And why do I need them to think well of me? Now, those of you who represent a larger company or corporation, you might not have that freedom. You might be hired to defend your company, and you have to. But I think that's what Jesus is doing.
Thank you. Another question?
I got a question up here.
Okay.
Okay, good.
Hey, Richard, I work as a chaplain in the hospital, and people often, when I work with dying patients, they'll ask me two questions. How do you pray for a miracle? And the second question they ask is, why is God so silent?
Really?
So can you speak to the second part?
The first thing that comes to my mind is you can't do all your homework at the end. And if you... That's what a lot of people, when you're dealing with people who live totally materialistic, self-centered, self-referential, as Pope Francis calls it now, self-referential lives, then they try to live in a larger frame in the last 5 months or 5 weeks of life, and it's a hard transition to make. I'm happy to say many of them succeed to get in, sometimes in the last 5 hours, but they finally get there into the bigger frame. But if you've never learned the more subtle language, and that's what it comes down to. Non-dual consciousness is subtle consciousness, subtle language. It's the in-between. It's what's written between the lines. It's what's surrounding and undergirding everything. Now, that takes years to learn that subtle language. I think that's what it means to pray. When you say, I'm going to pray, it means I'm going to listen at the more subtle level. Now, people who've never learned that more subtle level, and I'm not trying to be critical of folks, but they probably say, why is God so silent? Whereas, Emily Dickinson will say, every common bush is aflame with fire, Someone who's learned how to see, the voices are all around you constantly, everywhere. Well, maybe you'd say, shut up, God, you're talking too much, because you've learned the more subtle consciousness. But you can't tell them that, obviously. Remember, it's great love and great suffering that are the primary paths of transformation. So I'm afraid God is working the great suffering as they learn to surrender their lives, realize they're not in charge, the hours of the night that must be lonely and painful, that will be their teacher. And in that more subtle consciousness, hopefully they will learn that God is not so silent.
We have time for perhaps a couple more questions. Yes, ma'am in the blue. Really loud.
One,
Oh,
wait, one second.
I'm a UK fan.
Thank you. I'm not so sure that I have as much a question as I'd like you to have to make a comment to the relationship between pattern, technique, and undoing. I'm a fine artist, and I've spent the first half of my life, I've read all your books, so I'm familiar with your terminology, and thank you. It's been largely affirmational to my experience base. But I've spent the first half of my life learning and doing. I've spent the undercurrent of all of my life so far observing patterns and the subtleties. And I'm aware now that as I'm of a certain age, going to a certain age, it's about undoing for me. The undoing more than the doing.
Right on.
And I was wondering what relationship that had to silence, because I do center twice a day. I've been centering for about 4 years now. And that's been on the heels of where another spiritual journey that I've been on. It came in my life at just the right time. There's no coincidences, but if you could speak to the undoing with silence, I'd really appreciate it.
Would you mind if I replace the word undoing with unlearning?
No.
Yeah, okay, because I think that's where you want to go. Spirituality is much more unlearning than it is learning. And both Catholics and Protestants got that all confused. We thought it was a capitalistic achievement of more information. Sunday school, catechism class, both made the same mistake. Not that that was wrong, you had to create the container. But once you get into the transition, into the second half of life, and that's not strictly chronological, but just when you grow up and you ask more mature questions, you'll find that it's not a matter of getting more information, but in fact letting go of a lot of the certitudes, false certitudes that you thought you had. Or you as an artist, what you thought you saw and now what you really see. Huh? So thanks for focusing in on that word. The reason I hesitated with the word undoing is because even that could appeal to the ego. Do you understand? I'm the undoer. I'm going to make this. No, and I know that's not what you wanted to say. But unlearning will always be experienced as a losing, a giving up. It doesn't appeal to the ego. A surrendering, a not succeeding. It's that poverty that I talked about earlier. So I think you're on a good, trustworthy path. That's second half of life wisdom. Even though you probably have to start by learning or doing. You do. Like we all create our identities, and they serve us well. They give us a name, a platform to stand on, a few successes to make us feel important, and then you pay a price for it the rest of your life. But the trouble with people in wealthy countries and highly successful countries is we think we can just keep climbing higher. More doing, more doing, more doing. And that, as I say in Falling Upward, is really the avoidance of the second half of life.
Great book, by the way.
Oh, thank you. Did you want one more, Fons?
Actually, I was just told that we actually had time for a couple of more.
Oh, good, good.
We had a question over right here.
Yes, I have two questions. The first one is, I am from Harvard, and I have read one book by Steven Pinker, which says language comes from instinct of the mind. So I just wanted to see whether the mind and ego is same or different. Then second one is
Mind and ego are different? How they
are different, or same.
All right.
That is the first one. And then second one is, as a Buddhist, we study the wisdom book of Prajnaparamita, which is one of the most important wisdom book, which talks about inexpressibility, inexpressible.
Yes.
So going beyond sound, going beyond all kinds of objects. So my second question is whether the silence of the wisdom is same like the silence of the soul.
Oh.
So two questions.
Okay, let me try. And whatever I say will not be adequate. But we wouldn't want to say ego and mind are the same thing. But mind is the favorite hiding place of the ego. You understand? Because you feel intelligent. You feel like you're superior, smart, in control, rational. Use any of those words. So in some of my books, I use the term the mental ego. But you wouldn't want to say they're exactly the same at all. Mind can be detached from ego. I've seen people use their mental processes for very self-effacing research and discovery and work for other people. So you don't want to make mind inherently egocentric. It's just that the ego hides there because it's a very convenient place to hide, especially once you're educated. You think because you're verbal and can be articulate that gives you the capacity to be in control of all the data. And so and we've pandered to that in the world of religion. We really have. A lot of clergy have been trapped because they went to school, they think they're spiritual. So education is not the same as transformation. And those are two different schools entirely. And I think in the religious orders, that's what we meant by novitiate. At first, you had to experience some kind of spiritual encounter before you could let a guy study theology or study philosophy, because he'd use it all for his own egocentric purposes. Now, your second one, I think, if I understood it, I'm not saying it's the only way, I would largely create soul and wisdom. But the word soul is used in so many different ways by so many different authors. But the soul-centric person is the person who's moved into the larger realm than the mental ego. And it's more non-dual. It's more both and. It's more patient. It's more humble. It's more listening instead of talking. And so it's much more capable of wisdom. I remember when I was studying theology, and we were reading that list of the gifts of the Spirit in Isaiah and also in Paul. And in both cases, you might remember, knowledge and wisdom are listed as two different gifts of the Spirit. And hotshot that I said, Father, aren't they the same thing? Knowledge and wisdom? He said, no, they're different. You'll understand someday. Of course, he didn't explain to me how they did. But I think he's absolutely right. Knowledge is what you need to get you through the first half of life. But wisdom is what you need to enter into the second half of life. And our churches are rather good at teaching knowledge. Our own brand of in-house denominational knowledge, but nevertheless, knowledge of sorts. But we're not so good at transitioning people to the second half of life and to wisdom. And let me just sum that up by saying I think the reason for that, just my opinion, that's all, is I think there's a kind of helplessness with wisdom. Because the very essence of non-dual is you can't prove it. You understand? I can't prove to you that I'm right. I can't prove that you have to agree with me. It isn't rational. It isn't completely logical by Greek logic. It's in a larger sphere. Only other wise people at that same level will recognize it as true. That's why those people who teach spiral dynamics, you know, the 9 levels of consciousness, if you've read that, they said, and Fowler said the same thing, Kohlberg, Piaget, they all said it. The best you can do on a good day, is understand someone one level higher than yourself. That's on a good day. But if Jesus was a level 9 person, and most of history up to now has been level 2 or 3, does that explain half of history? Why the church just didn't know what Jesus was talking about. He's talking from this non-dual wisdom level. We're trying to prove that Catholics are better than Lutherans, you know? And Jesus just wants to say, well, go away. You know? You're wasting my time, and you're wasting, this isn't, the soul level, to get back to your question, the soul level isn't concerned about whether it's right. It really isn't. It just does its truth. and suffers the willingness to be thought of as wrong. It names its truth as best it can, but then it will name it in a sort of tentative, humble, patient way, you know? It's not so damn right. I'm a 1 on the Enneagram, so I've fought this all my life. Right? We 1s love to be right. And I just saw that need to be right never got me anywhere. Never taught me compassion. Never taught me love. Never taught me love of God or love of neighbor. And Jesus didn't, he never said, this is my commandment, thou shalt be right, did he? You would think he did. One more, is there, Father?
Well, I'm an 8 on the Enneagram. I'm looking for a fight. So
You're
anyway.
so sweet. You got a nice 7 smile.
Thank you. Yes, sir.
Yes.
So I'm trying to express a worry through this question. I hope the worry comes out.
Okay.
I really liked your comment about this dualistic binary thinking, and the worry is some of the things I hear about contemporary spirituality, the themes of the conference itself, for example, compassion, as we are emphasizing something, what's missing, say judgment or justice. Whereas compassion, because compassion is missing, so compassion gets emphasized. Or we talk about silence because perhaps the world is too noisy, so silence is missing, but then words are lost. In emphasizing silence, it's kind of like a binary, that now we talk about silence and compassion and justice and words are missing, and I'm really hoping that some of the presenters and great speakers would speak of these things relationally, like the Trinitarian way, the relationship between words and silence, compassion and justice or judgment, contemplation and action. Are we really saying the world outside is just chatter? Every word that is spoken is just chatter. There is a place for words. That's also thisness. So what's the thisness of words in relation to the substance? So I just wanted you to speak
Let me try. Okay. It's a very mature question. Sometimes we who are teaching, we have to make caricatures of the problem to get you to get the point. So like we'll call it chatter, or endless mental commentary. So you see how stupid it is. But in fact, the way I try to answer that was how I ended my talk. If you can begin with yes, and you know your yes is forthcoming and honest and heartfelt, then you necessarily have to go back to no. So that's why my next book is called Yes and. Yes and. You've got to see the negative, critical side of things, but you first honor them. You don't say, oh, all these people here in the bar are just chattering. Aren't they superficial and stupid? And I'm enlightened and I'm a contemplative. Well, you are not a contemplative if you think everybody in the bar is superficial and stupid. Or why did that thought even come into your head? Huh? It's your ego's need to feel higher than the people in the bar. But when you have no need to do that, but actually can recognize that gal hanging on the bar is a child of God. And she's surviving, and she's doing the best she can, and she's actually making some other people happy. Praise God for her, you know? I don't need to change her. I don't need to fix her. I don't need to rearrange her. But now, if she comes to you for spiritual direction the next day, you might say, honey, you know, I don't think that's the best use of your time every afternoon at the bar. You understand? But you first loved her, honored her, respected her. So it's combining yes with no and in the right sequence. Or otherwise, spirituality, religion in general, just becomes elitism. All it does is appeal to our sense of feeling morally superior to other people. And that's been a lot of religion. A lot of religion is a search for moral superiority, not a search for God. And that probably is a humiliating insight almost all of us have to have somewhere in the middle of life. Am I really searching for God, or am I just searching for moral high ground over other people? And that, let me end on that. The ego will take endless, endless, endless disguises, right? And one of its most successful disguises is religion itself. It's its best hiding place possible. I mean, I can't think of a better hiding place for the ego than to be super religious. Because your self-image is other than the truth, but you're attached to your self-image, not to the truth. So that's, I think, what we meant by shadow boxing, why shadow work was so important if you were an authentic. We call it going to confession, which probably limited it too much. The 12-step people tend to be rather good at this. The Mankind Project, too, in men's work, they just really teach men how to deal with their own shadow side. So when you see that, you know you're transitioning to second half of life spirituality. When you've developed a capacity for self-criticism. First half of life is just criticizing other religions. That's the giveaway. Why they're wrong, why they're no good, why they're inferior to us. When you start seeing your own dark side, your own phoniness, you've begun the movement to wisdom. Thank you.
A little bit more of good news is that everything, all the talks for this week are all streamed online. So you can go back and revisit this. Is it at the website, CIR website? Yes. Yes. Owsley says yes.
I'm not sure. Yes, and.
Yes, and. Presumptive regard that it will be there. So wonderful. And again, we will have a book signing opportunity and reception just out in the lobby immediately following. And don't forget the opportunity tonight to hear Merton's own words as he speaks to novices at Getson. And I'm about to do a silence. So thank you again, Father.
You're welcome. Thank you. eyes a smile, do you?